The United States president has arrived in Beijing for what officials describe as a consequential, closely watched visit, the first by an American president to China in nearly a decade. The trip is being framed in Washington as a chance to steady a strategic, sometimes fraught relationship. The administration says there will be a long talk about Iran, but trade will be the main focus. That short sentence captures the dual choreography of this visit: economic interests up front, security questions threaded through the agenda. Trade, at least on the surface, is the easier sell. For months now, Washington and Beijing have worked to preserve a fragile truce after a round of tit-for-tat tariffs and escalating penalties that rattled companies and markets. Officials on both sides say they want to avoid a return to the more aggressive posture of recent years. Against that backdrop, the president has traveled to the Chinese capital with a narrow, practical brief: shore up trade relations, rests for market access and protections for American workers and firms, and use the personal chemistry between leaders to convert understandings into enforceable commitments. But the visit is never only about commerce. The agenda will inevitably touch the hot points of great power competition. One in particular stands out: Taiwan. The United States intends to raise the subject of U.S. arms sales to Taipei, a longstanding part of American policy, and Beijing has made clear it views such sales as deeply provocative. The subject is a flashpoint precisely because it sits at the intersection of security and national pride. Even when leaders speak of spreadsheets and supply chains, issues like Taiwan and regional military postures can quickly pull conversations into a different register. Then there is Iran. The president has signaled he wants a dialogue. The substance and tone of that discussion and how it is received in Tehran and in capitals across the region will matter. On the surface, Iran's response has been measured. Iranian spokespeople in recent days emphasized that a U.S.-China meeting is a bilateral matter, something between Washington and Beijing, and not, in Tehran's view, a development that will alter Tehran's ties with Beijing. As one Iranian foreign ministry spokesman put it bluntly, the United States will not affect the relation between the Iranian and the Chinese. That phrasing, halting but emphatic, was intended to send a clear message. Iran sees its relationship with China as independent and resilient. Officials in Tehran point to long-term cooperation and repeated contact, and they underline what they call the strategic nature of the relationship: political dialogue, economic links, cultural engagement, and cooperation at the United Nations Security Council. In their telling, those ties are not conditional on what transpires between Beijing and Washington. The spokesman went further, invoking a longer-term pact. Now, textured, if imperfect language, we do know that there is an Agreement 25 back in 2020 about politics, about economy, about culture, and about other matters here in the region. While the language stumbled, the substance of the point was plain. Tehran refers to a broad, often discussed framework of cooperation with Beijing that is meant to anchor the relationship for years to come. Iranian officials describe that framework as a hedge against external pressure, an engine for investment and infrastructure, and a political signal that Tehran has diplomatic alternatives. How that dynamic plays out becomes particularly salient when we turn to the maritime domain. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strategic choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, remains a vital artery for global energy and a recurring source of tension. Recent open source reports and vessel tracking data suggest an uptick in traffic through the strait over the past day or two, a movement that has prompted questions and watchful monitoring in capitals from Tokyo to London to Washington. Iranian authorities have not offered an immediate point-by-point rebuttal to those reports, but their recent statements about the strait provide a guiding posture. Iranian officials have repeatedly said the strait remains open to commercial traffic, but under what they describe as new rules and new security arrangements. The traffic in the Strait of Hormuz is open, but under new regulation and security on that strategic waterway. One Iranian speaker said that formulation has two effects. It reassures shippers and customers that passage is possible, while simultaneously signaling that Iran intends to shape the conditions under which vessels transit the waterway. Elements of that posture are practical. Tehran points to trade routes that link the Gulf to Asian hubs and to neighboring states, naming connections to Pakistan, Iraq, Qatar, and beyond. As one correspondent put it, we are seeing right now what vessels, new traffic on that strategic waterway linked to Asian routes, linked to Pakistan, Iraq, coming from Qatar, coming from other countries, Chinese going and passing freely or safely through this strategic waterway. The repetition and stumble of the sentence underscores central point. Iran recognizes the commercial logic of the sea lanes and wants the world to know cargo continues to flow. At the same time, Iran's naval and security bodies, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, have been explicit about the line they plan to draw. In remarks that left little room for ambiguity, Iranian military representatives stressed the point that Tehran is asserting control and expects to be part of any safe transit arrangements. We are controlling this strategic waterway with new coordination, with new administration and arrangement, and you have to coordinate with us if you need a safe transit, they said. Those words are not merely bureaucratic posture. They are a statement about authority and influence in a region where control over waterways equates to leverage over markets and geopolitical outcomes. The combination of Beijing's deepening ties with Tehran and Tehran's new insistence on regulatory control over the Strait of Hormuz complicates the choreography of any great power meeting. For Washington, the calculation is delicate. On the one hand, the United States must press its economic case, seeking tariff relief, stronger intellectual property protections, and more reciprocal access for American businesses. On the other, Washington must also ensure that arms transfers to allies, freedom of navigation, and regional security commitments are not hollowed out by diplomatic compromises. For Beijing, this represents an opportunity and a dilemma. Chinese leaders want predictable energy supplies, stable routes for trade, and an environment in which their investments abroad can flourish. They also want to avoid being drawn publicly into a confrontation with Washington that could hurt their economic ambitions. China's growing role as an energy customer and as a partner to Tehran gives Beijing leverage. But it also obliges Beijing to balance relationships carefully to maintain access to global markets while keeping steady lines of communication with both Tehran and Washington. In Tehran, the message has been consistent. This is not the moment for panic or precipitous policy shifts. Iranian officials want both to reassure markets and to demonstrate resolve. Lines have been sent to domestic and regional audiences telling them that Iran's ties to China are deep, that Tehran will not be marginalized by an American visit to Beijing, and that it intends to manage regional security on its own terms. That posture is designed to preserve internal cohesion and to signal to partners and rivals alike that Iran remains a player, not a passive observer, yet the international consequences of this visit will depend as much Now, what is left unsaid as on what is spoken, high-stakes diplomacy often hinges on subtle shifts. A commitment to more transparent enforcement of trade rules, an agreement to open new channels for military-to-military communication, or a side conversation that eases logistical frictions in a vital waterway. The risk of misunderstanding is real. In recent years, a single miscalculation at sea has the potential to escalate far beyond the immediate incident. That reality is why many of the quiet technical elements of diplomacy, hotline numbers, port of call coordination, rules of engagement at sea, are as consequential as headline-grabbing trade announcements. There are also domestic political dynamics in play. Leaders in both the United States and China are mindful of their home audiences. In Washington, economic performance, jobs, and the costs of goods remain front and center. In Beijing, the leadership must manage nationalist sentiment alongside the priorities of state-led development, net and global partnerships. Each leader walks into the room with political constraints and incentives that shape bargaining positions. The longer-term strategic underpinnings, competition for influence across Asia, investments in infrastructure, and alignment in multilateral multilateral institutions will be negotiated over months and years, not just in a handful of bilateral meetings. Energy markets will watch closely. Shifts in the volume of crude that flows through the Strait of Hormuz, changes in insurance premiums for shipping, or variations in the behavior of key regional players can ripple quickly through global prices. If Chinese demand for oil from any source rises or falls in response to diplomatic shifts, markets will react. For exporters, diversifying routes and suppliers is always a priority. For importers, ensuring predictable, secure supply chains is a strategic imperative. So what could a successful outcome look like? At minimum, leaders could agree to mechanisms that reduce the risk of unintended escalation, clearer communication protocols at sea, enhanced information sharing about commercial traffic, and joint statements that affirm the importance of uninterrupted passage for civilian shipping. On trade, concrete steps could include timetables for tariff rollback or mechanisms to settle disputes without resorting to punitive measures. On Taiwan, a successful outcome, if one is possible, would be an agreement to manage tensions responsibly, to avoid unilateral changes to the status quo, and to keep channels open for deconfliction. What would failure look like? Sharp rhetoric about arms transfers, renewed tariffs, or public accusations that erode trust would raise the odds that routine incidents spiral into broader confrontations. If one side perceives the other as gaining a unilateral advantage, whether in regional influence or market access, the relationship could harden at precisely the moment both sides say they want predictability. For Iran, the stakes are twofold. There is the immediate question of whether its economic ties with Beijing will continue to insulate it from pressure elsewhere. And there is the strategic question of whether control over maritime approaches will be accepted by regional actors and global carriers. Iran's insistence on coordination and new administrative arrangements for the Strait is a clear signal that it is seeking recognition of a more assertive role in shaping regional security. How other powers respond through diplomacy, naval presence, or economic leverage will determine whether that role becomes normalized or contested. The president's meetings with the Chinese leadership will therefore be watched not only in capitals, but on shipping bridges and oil trading floors. Words and gestures exchanged in diplomatic salons can have immediate material consequences. Shipping routes may be rerouted, contracts renegotiated, and insurance rates adjusted. Beyond the immediate economics, the symbolism of leaders meeting and the tone they set can influence how allies and rivals interpret the balance of power. As the motorcade winds through Beijing and meeting rooms fill, the choreography of diplomacy will unfold in layers. Public pronouncements focus on trade and mutual interest. Private conversations will probe the limits of cooperation on issues like Iran, Taiwan, and maritime security. At each turn, both sides will be weighing risk against reward, calculation against conviction. There is a final human dimension to bear in mind. Diplomacy is more than the sum of policy positions, is also the product of relationships, of gestures, of trust built slowly over repeated exchanges, and of the art of managing disagreement without letting it define the entire relationship. That is the quiet work of these visits, to create space for future cooperation, to build mechanisms that prevent accidents, and to recognize that in an interconnected world, commerce and security are not separate spheres, but two sides of the same coin. In the days ahead, watch for practical measures. Announcements about tariff talks, commitments to better information sharing at sea, and language designed to calm markets. Listen, too, for the subtext, whether leader-to-leader rapport allows for candid conversations on Iran's role in the region, and whether both sides can chart a path that protects their core interests without forcing the others into a corner. Above all, expect nuance. Great power diplomacy rarely produces clean victories. Instead, it yields incremental steps, guarded promises, and occasionally lasting mechanisms that make crises less likely. The world will be watching how trade rhetoric is balanced with security reality, how Tehran's messaging about its ties to Beijing is met in Beijing's corridors, and how the fragile flow of commerce through a narrow strait is kept open in practice, not just in principle. For now, as leaders meet and delegations negotiate, late into. The evening, the message from Tehran is clear and unambiguous in tone, if not always in grammar. This visit between Washington and Beijing will not, they say, upend Iran's ties with China. The United States will not affect the relation between the Iranian and the Chinese. Iranian security officials have likewise underlined their intent to assert control over a critical waterway. We are controlling this strategic waterway with new coordination, with new administration and arrangement. And you have to coordinate with us if you need a safe transit. Those are the words that will linger as the talks move from official podiums to private rooms. How the great powers and the regional actors caught between them translate those words into practice will shape the next chapter of a complex, consequential relationship.